Hello, my dear friends. How are you? I'm Ergi, and today I'm going to talk about the number 9 in Norse mythology. Just a quick overview to get the basic idea. So, I won't waste your time, or at least I will try to not waste much of it, and I'm going straight to it. The number 3, as you know, it plays several important roles in many cultures and religious stories and mythologies, but it is the number 9 that seems to have been the mythical number for Northern European cultures. Truth be told, of course, in the Old Norse myths and literary sources, there are other numbers that appear as often as the number 9, such as the numbers 3, 5, and 7. However, it is the number 9 that is usually linked to major events, but it also seems to have a special connection with feminine figures, be those goddesses or other supernatural female entities, and female magic and power in general. While there is no doubt that the other numbers have their own mythical and magical significance, of course, it is the number 9 that is often connected to both myths and cult, that expresses primary events, circumstances, and situations in which the outcome makes it possible for life, creation, and evolution to carry on. The number 9 in Norse mythology isn't only related to magic, but also aspects of fertility and life-giving powers. Take a couple of examples, such as Odin's self-sacrifice. He hung for 9 nights, or 9 days in general, in the great tree Yggdrasil. There are 9 realms actually in Norse myths. Each one of them is related to 9 female giants. Heimdallr was born to 9 mothers. The god Freyr had to wait 9 nights for his marriage to Gertr, and Aegir and Ran, they have 9 daughters. There are other examples, of course, obviously, but let's focus on just a few and keep it simple and short so we won't drift away too much from the main subject, which is the number 9. Perhaps the importance isn't particular the number 9 per se, but perhaps it is the number 3. The number 9 being 3 times 3. The multiplicity of 3 is important, and many characters and gods and other entities in Norse myths appear as 3 or 9, and very rarely also 12, being precisely 4 times 3, creating a dual equation out of the multiplication of the 3 over itself. But we shall see that further ahead. Just a quick note in relation to the number 12. The number 9 is sometimes, especially nowadays, it's sometimes seen as the special number due to the idea of 9 cosmic worlds, which in fact they are not cosmic in the sense of actually being planets. They are just realms. Heimar, which Snorre Sturluson mentioned in the Prose Edda, which eventually led to mistranslations as worlds. Nowhere in the sources comes this idea of 9 worlds, but realms. In earlier accounts, we see that there are much more than only 9 realms, Heimar, actually, and all linked together as a sort of geographical mapping where different entities live and where myths take place, which is very much in relation to our own world, actually our own reality, environmental and geographical mythology. Snorre Sturluson got the idea from an earlier source, the Voluspa, which refers to 9 giantesses before the creation of the world and before Yggdrasil grew in the world itself. In a way, Yggdrasil will eventually link 9 worlds, which are actually realms, Heimar, which are 9 giantesses, troll, magic women, right? This is important to take in mind because this reflects yet another mythological account in Northern Europe, of course, that once again expresses creational myth connected to mother figures, a matriarchal perspective of the creation of life. Nowadays, a great emphasis is given to Odin, especially in neo-pagan Nordic polytheistic religious manifestations, as Odin being the All-Father and all of that. And indeed, certainly, without a doubt, there is a myth in which Odin and his two brothers, Vili and Ve, are responsible for the creation of the physical world by using the body parts of Ymir. And we see in here the number 3 associated with gods of creation, Odin, Vili, and Ve. And there's another myth where Odin, alongside two others, again, the number 3, where he is indeed responsible for gifting the first humans with specific components, let's say, that are essential to wake life in humanity. However, there are more Northern European creational myths that involve women or a feminine figure or several feminine figures, and such accounts are sadly often not mentioned. But indeed, the Voluspa presents another creational myth concerning 9 troll women. A troll in the sense of being magical, being primordial feminine beings, possessors of magic, who create the world and life. But we shall return to this in a moment further ahead. And well, since I've spoken about the 3 gods either shaping the physical world or waking life in humanity, it won't do any harm, I hope, mentioning another important mythological conception involving the number 3, which is among the continental Germanic peoples, Iron Age. In the mythological fragments that have survived, of course, there was a god called Tuisto or Tuisko, the same that would reach Scandinavia eventually during the migration period, Iron Age, and would be called in Scandinavia Tuir. Tuisto had a son named Manos, who in turn had 3 sons, each founder of a tribal group, the Engaivanes, the Armenones, and the Aistivanes. Now, the general scheme of this myth is very similar, almost identical to one of the Nordic myths of creation, involving the primordial being Ymir, as I have mentioned before, who has a son who in turn is the father of 3 brothers. Almost identical because Snorre Sturluson refers to an additional generation between Ymir and Thor, giving more emphasis to the number 3, creating 3 generations that led eventually to the creation of 3 brothers as the creators of the physical world, Odin, Vili, and Ve. It is without a doubt an old mythological model which different communities in different times, in different eras, and even geographical places and have shaped differently. As we have seen, this mythological model among the Iron Age continental Germans would be used to trace tribal origins, while among the Norse, about 1,000 years later, the model would serve or would be used to explain the origins of the gods and the world itself, the physical world. This is a good example, actually, of how the general narrative structures can survive the succession of generations and the succession of time, obviously, but take on different contents and meanings depending on the time and space and evolution of cultures and the very evolution of human thought, the human mind, and the world perceptions, and obviously religious understandings. And I think it won't do much harm either to also specifically mention biblical cases in which the number 3 plays a particularly important role, because it isn't just the fact that the number 3 is indeed a number which occurs in many religious cultures, religious stories and mythologies, but the number 3 does appear quite often in the prose Edda. So in some situations, I have no doubt that it's a Judeo-Christian religious influence from the part of Snorre Sturluson. After all, he was a Christian in a Christian society writing for Christians. But, of course, in many pre-Christian mythologies and religious stories, the number 3 is very recurrent, as I've said, as I've pointed out before. So I wouldn't take the appearance of the number 3 in Old Norse late literature, especially Icelandic literature, as evidences of just and only Christian influence, but also because without a doubt the number 3 was important for many pre-Christian and even pre-Jewish religious cultures, right? But anyway, turning to Christianity, just so we can have specific accounts in mind, so it will be perhaps easier to try to perceive what may be a Christian influence or several Christian influences in Norse myths and what may not, obviously. The number 3 is important in Christian tradition, especially when it comes to precisely to the case of the Holy Trinity. More specifically, the Father, the Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. 3 distinct persons, let's say, which are one, the representation of God, the same God, in these 3 aspects. Of course, this conception only appears in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and without a doubt, a Greco-Roman pagan religious influence. But that's precisely where I want to reach. Because in Northern Europe, when the cult of Odin and Thor progressively gained more expression, more religious expression after the migration period, Iron Age precisely, we see that in southern Sweden, the most prominent god was Freyr. But as the cult of Odin and Thor gained more religious grounds, more religious expression among the elite, the nobility, and progressively puts aside other gods, even local gods, by the early Middle Ages in Scandinavia, Odin and Thor join Freyr, and there's the cult of a triad. I'm not saying this is a Christian influence, mind that, because I don't think it is. Cults to divine triads were very common among various pre-Christian pagan cultures, and such triads, divine triads, are often representative of different social groups. And those religious conceptions are precisely, in a way, the basis for the conception of the Christian Holy Trinity to begin with, in the first place. What is important to take in mind is precisely the difference between the 3 gods in Northern Europe, Odin, Thor, and Freyr, often worshipped together in the Middle Ages and throughout the Viking period, and the Christian Holy Trinity. Among ancient pagans, the cult of 3 deities was very recurrent, as I've said, as either 3 aspects of the same deity or as 3 distinct deities, the latter being the case of Odin, Thor, and Freyr, worshipped together in Scandinavia in the Viking Age period, in the Viking period. While the Christian Holy Trinity is 3 distinct persons as representations of the same deity. So, in Northern Europe, displays of faith towards Odin, Thor, and Freyr as a divine triad isn't likely to be a Christian influence, but accounts of 3 gods, often unspecified 3 gods, in later Icelandic accounts especially, may be indeed Christian religious influences, such as the case of Odin, Vili, and Ve, who seem to have been previously 3 distinct deities related to mythical accounts of the origins of Germanic Iron Age tribes or continental Germans, but in late Old Norse literature, these 3 gods became associated with the creation of the world and subsequently of humanity. So there is a religious evolution in here. And furthermore, in Gylfaginning, Snorre Sturluson specifically makes a reference to 3 great gods sitting in 3 thrones. One is Hor, high, the other is Jafnhor, just as high, and the last is Thridi, third. So in the 13th century in Iceland, 200 years after Catholicism became the official religion of the Icelandic society, you think Snorre Sturluson, a Christian, was being faithful to the Norse myths in this particular aspect of these 3 gods? Or is this a Christian influence based on the conception of the Holy Trinity, which by Snorri's own time was a conception well known for already 1,000 years? The question remains. No doubt Snorre Sturluson was aware of the importance of the number 3 in Old Norse myths, surely, but also no doubt he was very much aware of the importance of that same number, the number 3, in Catholicism, which was, after all, his own religion. And this conception of 3 gods in Gylfaginning was probably Snorre Sturluson taking advantage of both religious cultural realities, Christian and heathen. Of course, obviously, there are other mythological accounts and religious stories, in Northern Europe that reflect this idea of the importance of the number 3, linked to divinities, to gods, that do not seem to be directly influenced by Christianity, or at least the bases are not Christian, such as in the poetic Edda, 3 gods, great gods, descend once again to the world, one being Odin, who gave soul or breath to humanity, Ymir gave spirit or senses and emotions, and Lothur gave warmth, life, animation, and flesh, gave body, god likeness. Other accounts where the number 3 appears, the 3 consecutive winters without summer in between before the coming of Ragnarok, also important to mention, I think. But I think the account where the number 3 appears more often is in the Volsunga saga, which reflects many other known Norse myths. In the Volsunga saga, there's Volsunga himself, the son of Freyr, who travels with 3 ships. Signy sleeps with her brother Sigmundur for 3 nights in order to get pregnant, and gives birth to Sinfjotli, who will avenge their father, Volsungur. Borghildur, the first wife of Sigmund, offers 3 times the poisoned drink to Sinfjotli, who finally accepts it, drinks it, and dies. Regin only succeeds in making the sword that Sigurd needs to kill the dragon Fafnir after the 3rd and final attempt. And, of course, Sigurd himself, the hero, who shapeshifts into Gunnar, puts a sword between him and Brunhildur for 3 nights after their wedding to avoid intercourse with his bro's wife. I mean, that would have been a really cheap move from the part of Sigurd, which would have totally go against the bro code. So, even though these accounts are from pre-Christian periods and from oral tradition, they have been for quite some time in oral tradition, they have been recorded not only after Christianity had already settled in the north, but also accounts compiled by Christians. So, to what extent were these accounts influenced by Christianity? How much of Christian religious influences were added to these accounts by the Christians who compiled, wrote, and to a certain extent even composed them? And, or, how much did these accounts influence Christianity itself? Certainly, it is interesting to see that the symbolic meanings, linguistic or cultural common grounds of the number 3 are present in both Christian and Northern European cultures. So perhaps it's also a question of being very easy for us nowadays to make a fusion between the 2 religious cultural worlds or cultural realities. It's not easy to perceive the religious influences present in Norse myths. Some are more perceptible than others, of course, obviously. But the case of triple gods, or gods that come in groups of 3, well, it isn't easy. But without a doubt, the number 3 has played a very important religious and magic role in many cultures, I mean, since humanity can count past 2. Returning to what I was saying previously, speaking of the realms or worlds in Norse myths, perhaps it's also important to refer the account Grimnismal, preserved in the medieval Icelandic manuscript Codex Regius of the 13th century. The Grimnismal speaks about 12 worlds, 12 realms. Some of these worlds or realms are higher even than those of the gods. They belong to the light elves. Since this account is quite late and after the Christianization, or after Christianity became the official religion in Scandinavian countries and medieval kingdoms, 10th century for Norway, 11th century for Sweden and Iceland, well, the importance of the number 12 here might be something else entirely. We do know that many late accounts of the 13th century including the works of Snorre Sturluson, were also heavily influenced by other cultures, not just Christianity, not just Catholicism. And even during the Viking Age, many Scandinavians not only had already adopted Christian religious conceptions, but they were also very much aware of Muslim and Jewish religious conceptions and incorporated them into their own pagan belief systems as early as the 9th century. And the prose Edda reflects many Judeo-Christian influences. It's true. It's in there. You just have to read it, which is not surprising, actually, given the fact that the 13th century marks precisely the consolidation of Western and Eastern folk practices and folk magic. And many Europeans by this time were very much interested in Kabbalistic teachings, especially in Central Europe, where it is nowadays Germany. So I'm not sure how far the number 12 in later accounts is related to Jewish religious conceptions, but that is something for another time, obviously, which requires a deeper study, and I'm still not quite convinced, obviously. But in the Grimnismal, it might still follow the multiplicity of the number 3, but 4 times, making the number 12, which isn't unheard of in Norse myths, but not that common. It's very rare, actually. It is more common to find the number 3 multiplied over itself 3 times, the number 9, precisely because 3 is the important number and not the number 4. Anyway, the number 3 and 9 appear quite often in Norse myths in relation to feminine figures or entities in general, be those goddesses, Valkyries, Valkyriur, or others who represent the aspect of the maiden. As I said, there were 9 giantesses before the world, the physical world, demonstrating a type of cosmology linked to a more matriarchal type of governance. And this is curious because in the literary sources, we also have that 9 giant maidens simultaneously gave birth to Heimdallr. And Heimdallr means literally illuminating world. So they create the world. Literally, what might be indeed implied in here, in this account of the 9 mothers of Heimdallr, is precisely the earlier mythological account of the 9 Thor's maidens, the 9 troll or giant women who create the world, and Heimdallr being literally the illuminating world, our world. As I said before, many people, especially nowadays, usually focus on the idea that Odin and his brothers created the world. But Norse mythology has a lot of creational myths, actually, some of which give us a more matriarchal conception, indeed. And others, obviously, involve Odin as well and his brothers, or Odin and other 2 figures. And actually, this makes me consider the meaning of Odin's self-sacrifice at Yggdrasil. He spent 9 days and 9 nights, or just 9 days in general, hanging and bleeding quite a lot in Yggdrasil to learn the secrets of the runes from the beyond. Since Yggdrasil is linked to the 9 cosmic mothers, or primordial mothers, was Odin spending that amount of time to learn from the primordial mother's wisdom? After all, Odin's sacrifice represents a near-death experience, so Yggdrasil, as the axis mundi, the central pillar of the world, could very well be the means to travel between realms or to reach the 9 cosmic or primordial mothers, to reach or have the original mothers of creation and their primordial wisdom. And speaking of Odin, the importance of the number 9 is repeated once again in Snorre's version of the Gunnlod account and the death of Odroirir. Odroirir, either one of the 3 vessels that contains the mead of poetry or the mead of poetry itself. In this account, Odin does the work of 9 thralls, 9 slaves on the fields of the giant Algi. 3 draughts were necessary for Odin to fill himself up with the mead from all the 3 cauldrons after spending 3 nights with Gunnlod. We see here the number 3 quite often and repeated in relation to the mead of poetry, Odroirir, or the substance that gives great wisdom of all things. 3 draughts, 3 cauldrons, and 3 nights. The number 3, repeated 3 times, is obviously the number 9. The number 3 is also associated with female beings, just as the number 9. In some accounts, the 3 Thurs maidens who instigated the creation of humankind, and the 3 Norns who carved the runes of fate in the beginning of time. So it's clear that the number 3 and 9, the 9 itself being a multiplicity of 3, is a recurrent theme in Norse myths, especially concerning cosmological events, which certainly constitutes something very important. But what exactly? That is the real question, right? The truth is, it is impossible to really decide exactly what the number 3 and 9 mean in Norse cosmology. Perhaps a cycle, stage of birth, life, and death, or maybe initiation. We shall return to this idea of initiation further ahead. But perhaps the number 9 is in relation to death, if we consider a couple of conceptions that link 9 to death, such as Odin's 9 nights or 9 days in general at Yggdrasil. Hel rules only in 9 worlds or realms. Her mother takes 9 days on the road to Hel to finally reach the realm of the dead. And the goddess Freyr, a goddess linked to death and choosing part of the dead in the battlefield, rules in the 9th world. So we see here some ideas related to death and linked with the number 9 indeed. And speaking of death and dying and in relation to the number 9, I think it's also relevant, I hope, to mention the sacrifices at Old Uppsala in Sweden. Sacrificial feasts lasting 9 days are mentioned for both Uppsala and Leire, actually. Some accounts stating that such sacrifices were held every 9 years, and 9 of every species sacrificed, at least human, dog, hawk, horse, goat, and cow, and possibly, most likely, also pig and boar were part of these sacrificial subjects. But what most accounts seem to agree on, there is no dispute, is that such sacrificial feasts lasted 9 days. This sacrifice may have been a reenactment of creation. The same account here spoken before of the 9 cosmic or primordial mothers. Ancient pagan cultures did this quite a lot, reenactments of myths of creation to ensure the continuation of life within the human community. I've spoken about this before on other videos, about the necessity and the importance to enact creational myths within the human society, to bring forth the same life-giving powers and energy to propitiate fertility in the human world. But such sacrifices, at least at Old Uppsala in Sweden and throughout the Viking period in there, seem to have been mostly, if not just, dedicated to Freyr, the god of fertility, peace, and plenty. As I said before, Freyr in the myths has to wait 9 nights to marry his beloved woman, Gerdr, an entity by itself also related to fertility aspects of life, and the pig and the boar was by far the most sacrificed animal in Northern Europe, especially in the Viking period, throughout the Viking period. And such an animal, as you know, is strongly related not only to Freyr and his sister Freyja, but also to the Vanir gods as a whole. I've given some examples of sacrifices involving pigs or boars related to Freyr in the previous video. And in those same sacrifices, the pig or the boar serving as the conductive sacrificial subjects between humanity and the gods of fertility, especially with Freyr, the god Freyr. But since we are speaking about Freyr, and given the previous examples of the number 9 related to death, I have just remembered something that also might be relevant. Freyr waits for 9 nights to be with his love, as I said, and in this time period, Freyr loses his sword in exchange for the hand of his soon-to-be bride, and the loss of his sword will have a terrible outcome in events to come, because Freyr is killed during the great conflict at Ragnarok, precisely because he is no longer in possession of his magic sword. So he isn't able to protect himself, to defend himself. Thus, he is ultimately defeated and killed. Remember that. So not only we see here the number 9 related to fertility or life-giving powers, but also related to death and major events that cause a permanent change in the cycle of life. And in Northern Europe, and in fact, much of the prehistoric cults and religions, especially in the Neolithic, death and fertility are always related or entwined, and there is this continuous idea of the underworld, the earth beneath our feet, literally being the realm of the dead, of the deceased, and the dead themselves propitiating fertility to the living, to the upper world. And this idea wasn't yet lost to Scandinavians during the Viking period, during the Middle Ages. In fact, cults related to Freyr and Freya as fertility deities, and other cults related to fertility in general, obviously, were usually performed or held near or on top of burial mounds, and maintaining that link between the dead and fertility. As some of the dead, not all of them, especially those within burial mounds, the burial dwellers, upon death became elves, the Olfar, as entities providers of fertility as one of their attributes. And the god Freyr was precisely considered to be the lord or the king of the elves. In this sense, literally the lord of the burial dwellers. The burial mound being the physical representation of one of the afterlife realms within the Vanir cult, as being precisely the representation of an afterlife place within the world of the living, and sacrifice, cult, and other displays of faith on burial mounds was taken as a symbolic walk between worlds, literally crossing the boundary into the realm of the dead, into the burial mound, and back. So, unlike the number 3, which makes it hard to grasp where does Christian influence begins or ends or even takes place in Old Norse myths and religious stories, the number 9 is much more powerful, I think, and more often linked to pagan legends in both myths and religious stories, and in the sagas as well, obviously, in Icelandic sagas. But I think it's very curious that the number 9 is almost always related to feminine supernatural entities, goddesses and other female beings, or femininity in general, and female magic and power. 9 mothers, 9 daughters, 9 worlds or realms, which are the 9 giantesses, and 9 nights Freyr waits to consummate the marriage with his bride, the goddess Freya, who governs in the 9th world, the goddess Hel, who rules over 9 worlds or realms, and even the 9 days Odin spends in Yggdrasil. Odin in the sources is often considered effeminate and transgender, actually. The only male god who practices Seidr. Seidr often considered to be a magical divinatory art related to the feminine as a whole, to women alone, and men who practiced Seidr were often considered effeminate. Please pay close attention to this. The whole account of Odin's sacrifice to acquire knowledge has many parallels with the performances of Seidr. In several accounts, Seidr not only is performed by women, generally the Volur, soothsayers and prophetesses, but also it is always implied divination. It was a method or a divinatory oracular art in which the Volva, the prophetess or the soothsayer or the seeress, received secret knowledge from her tutelary spirits. She received knowledge from external means through the alteration of consciousness, or at the very least, the alteration of perception, symbolically reflected in the idea of shifting worlds, shifting perception. So the idea of Odin spending 9 days in his self-sacrifice with a lot of loss of blood to acquire knowledge is a reflection of a Seidr performance. Odin spent 9 days turning into a woman to access knowledge, knowledge which in the Old Norse society was only available to women, practitioners of Seidr. Again, Odin in the sources is often accused of being effeminate or becoming a woman, actually, precisely for practicing Seidr as a magical religious art considered to be a solely women's magic and solely for women in the Old Norse society. And this idea of Odin becoming a woman for 9 days, or a ceremonial or cultic process that lasts 9 days to become a woman or to be transgender in order to acquire wisdom and feminine power, isn't as far-fetched as some of you may think right now, if you are still watching. I'm not going into details consider shamanism and transgender or the gender identity in shamanism, not in this video anyway, because, well, I have already done a video about it, and I urge you to watch it if indeed you want to further delve into this subject. And please check the description of this video for other videos related to this subject. But, well, I'm not going into details related to that, as I've already spoken about it before, and I don't want to waste your time again. But it's always important to remember the similarities between the transgender identity of the shaman, of the spiritual leader, often to acquire wisdom, shifting identity, gender identity, to acquire knowledge and power from tutelary spirits, and the Seidr performances in Old Norse society and the women who performed Seidr, which bear striking similarities with the figure of the shaman, of the spiritual leader, especially in relation to the relationship built by both the shaman and the Seidr performer with their tutelary spirits. But even though I'm not going into details concerning the gender identity and transgender identity in shamanism, I would very much like to specifically point out one important account where we see this process of a man becoming a woman for 9 days, which is in Njol's saga. In Njol's saga, there is a response towards Njol's masculinity and an expression of scorn, which is typical in late Old Norse accounts related to men who practice magical arts which were perceived or deemed to be solely for women. The account tells us that the man becomes the wife of a male ogre from Svinafell every 9th night. This account has been overlooked and taken as simply homophobia, and that being homosexual in the Norse society was seen as something very wrong and bad and quite negative, even a sin, which isn't true at all. Actually, I've done a video about that. This particular passage expresses the connection a man has, a male figure has, with a pagan cult still active during this period at Svinafell in Iceland. A pagan cult in which the leadership belongs to a man, the spiritual leader being a man, possibly a case of transgender identity from the part of the spiritual leader himself. Let's call a shaman as a general term for a better understanding. And every 9th night, the devotees or the practitioners of this Seidr performance are men and became women, the wives of the spiritual leader, in order to acquire secret knowledge, the same way women did in their Seidr performances. This isn't the only account expressing the transformation of men into women at 9 days intervals. And I've probably placed a note in here, I hope, and I do very much hope you were able to read it, so you can get the idea that the account of Odin being the only male god practicing Seidr and often being called effeminate for it in the sources, and this idea of self-sacrifice for 9 days is indeed in relation to the transgender aspects of Seidr and of Odin. Still noticeable today in many societies in which shamanism is the basis of the religious spiritual sphere of those same societies. And the spiritual leader often plays the transgender role or shifts gender identity, which I've explained in more detail on that other video I've mentioned. And now, as given these accounts, we go back to the account of Freyr having to wait 9 nights to be with his bride. I think this has also been overlooked. It's not a question of Freyr waiting 9 nights to get married or to consummate the marriage per se, but it is an initiation process to transform into a woman at every 9th night. Again, the same scheme. Actually, not the initiation process in itself, but the preparation for the initiation. And only then, in the 9th night, the actual initiation experience begins, symbolized in the culmination of the 9 nights Freyr will have to endure before the consecrating act of sacred marriage. Freyr, much like his sister Freya, they are the gods of peace and plenty, but also the gods of the entwined aspects of fertility and sexuality and magic. In the account of the 9 nights Freyr has to endure, it is specifically expressed that indeed it is painful to endure. It is something the god himself does not take lightly. It is unbearable to wait this long. The suffering of Freyr will only come to an end, when he reaches the sacred grove of his supposed bride. It demonstrates a course, a path that Freyr must take to reach another realm, another reality. One that is governed by a feminine entity. And this whole process and waiting, which is clearly painful to endure, and Freyr is in suffering, as it is expressed in this source, is also very similar to the self-sacrifice of Odin for 9 days. The exact same number of days until Odin acquired the secret wisdom from another realm. It is a 9 nights trial until the subject is ready for the initiation process to begin, and to begin delving into the primordial wisdom of the feminine entities. A 9 nights trial probably imposed to men who wanted to be part of a women's cult, but also be part of a women's sacred society. Men identifying themselves as women and the process of transformation to be part of this religious reality, to be accepted in it. A 9 days trial Odin also endured, just like Freyr, and other accounts that demonstrate this reality in Old Norse society, and men who identify themselves as women and the process to enter a women's society, a women's world, a women's worldview even, and of course to enter women's magic, to fully become a woman of mind, body, soul, and spirit. So again, the number 9 related to the feminine, which always seems to go back to that early myth of creation within the Voluspa, expressed in the Voluspa, of the 9 giantesses, the 9 primordial mothers who created the world, which also matches the myth of Heimdallr's 9 mothers. Heimdallr meaning literally the illuminating world, our world. So again, 9 primordial mothers creating the world itself and all life subsequently. Well, that's it, and I must say that originally my plan was to only talk about the number 9, but well, I guess I got a little bit excited back there and ended up also speaking a little bit about the number 3, which I think it's important to understand, to also understand number 9. And I must say I'm surprised with myself, which is something that doesn't happen very often. But with the medication I'm taking lately due to health problems, I'm very surprised I've made this far in this video and I've managed to sort of keep it all together. But I'm a little bit accelerated, as you can see. And well, congratulations to myself. A pat on the back. Anyway. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video and I very much hope this was useful in some way. Thank you for your time and your patience, obviously. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.